When people are talking about traits, they're referring to the words that people use to describe themselves and others in their everyday lives. So there are adjectives such as things like shy, devious, manipulative, open, or friendly. If you went to Webster's unabridged dictionary, you would find that there are about 18,000 words that could be used to distinguish one person from another. And this is exactly what Allport and Odbert did in 1936. Trait theorists then use a statistical technique called factor analysis to reduce this diversity down to a smaller group of underlying traits. Although there's no complete consensus among trait theorists regarding the most scientifically supported model of personality structure, the Big Five has received the most attention. Coster and McRae developed this test in 1987 and they called it the Big Five. They found that despite the myriad of personality traits that we use to describe people, they do tend to cluster in 5 areas. This approach measures the 5 factors of personality, which are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Openness to experience. And this openness to experience is a tendency to be imaginative and intellectually curious and show independence in judgment. The next factor is conscientiousness. This is a tendency to be goal-directed, organised, attentive to detail. The third factor is extroversion. And this is a tendency to be sociable, talkative, assertive, and active. The fourth factor is agreeableness. And this is a tendency to comply with others' requests, a tendency to be trusting of others and sympathetic. The 5th factor is neuroticism. And this is a tendency to be anxious and nervous as opposed to calm and well-adjusted. I've listed them in this order as it spells out the acronym OCEAN, which is one way to remember the 5 big personality traits. According to the Big Five advocates, we can use these factors to describe all people, including those with psychological disorders. A severely depressed person, for example, may be low in extroversion, high in neuroticism, and above average on the other 3 dimensions. Each of the 5 factors represents an amalgam of several more specific traits. For example, as you can see in the table, people high on neuroticism tend to be anxious, depressed, impulsive, and so on. These lower order traits are called facets of the 5-factor model. The test has 243 items, 3 of which are validity check items, which is used to check whether people have filled the test in correctly or not. The test is designed for people aged 17 years and over, so essentially it's for adults. There are also 3 formats to the test. There's a self-report format, where the person fills it in themselves. There's a short form, which is 60 items, and there are observer reports, where others fill it in about the person, which could be a peer, a spouse, or other experts. Each item is rated on a 5-point scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And the items assess behavioural, emotional, experiential, attitudinal, and motivational variables. At the end, it produces a profile with bands reflecting very low, low, average, high, and very high scores on each of those 5 domains. And here's a summary of those 5 domains. We'll go through them again. So extroversion or sociability or positive emotionality. The sort of items on this domain look at how energetic one is. People who score high on this factor like to work in cooperation with others, are talkative, enthusiastic, excitement-seeking. People who score low on this factor prefer to work alone and can be perceived as cold, difficult to read, even a bit eccentric. Next, we've got neuroticism, or inversely, emotional stability, or negative emotionality. So this is a tendency to worry. People who score low on this factor are usually calm, relaxed, and rational, and may sometimes be perceived as lazy and incapable of taking things seriously. People who score high on this factor are alert, anxious, sometimes worried. The next factor is agreeableness, and this describes one's level of orientation towards other people. Those who score high on this factor are usually cooperative, they can be submissive, and concerned with the well-being of others. People who score low on this factor can be challenging, competitive, and sometimes even argumentative. The next factor we look at is conscientiousness. This looks at how structured one is. People who score high on this factor are usually productive and disciplined and single-tasking. People who score low on this factor are often less structured, less productive, but can be more flexible and inventive and can be multitasking. The final scale is openness to experience or openness to ideas. This is a tendency to be speculative and imaginative. People who score high on this factor are curious and sometimes unrealistic. People who score low on this factor are down to earth and practical and sometimes obstructive of change. The NEO has excellent reliability, with reliabilities ranging from 0.86 to 0.95 for both the self and observer rating forms of this instrument. Both short-term test retest reliability and long-term test retest reliability has been shown for these domains. There's a strong consensual validity between self, peer and spouse reports of the test. That's known also, as you remember from before, as inter-rater reliability. Construct, convergent and divergent validity evidence for the scales has been collected by Costa and McRae. Norms are based on a sample of 1,000 subjects. This is constituted by 500 males and 500 females who've been selected from 3 large-scale studies. The normative sample was designed to match the 1995 US Census projections for age, gender and race. So they tried to represent the United States population at the time. As you can see, that may mean that it's less valid for Australian participants. Nevertheless, it's a well-used test in Australia. With this test, there is some ability to aid in clinical diagnosis, that is, looking for psychological problems, but typically designed to measure personality across, but this test is typically designed to measure personality across non-clinical individuals. So pretty much looking at personality among the general population. One major criticism is a lack of lie scales. This is concerning because it means that participants can fake their results one way or another without any items testing for this faking. One of the strengths are that there are cross-cultural identification factors. Research in multiple countries has produced remarkably similar results, which is pretty impressive because of the wide variety of languages from different linguistic families that have reproduced the 5-factor model, from English and German to Turkish and Korean. The items of personality scales are developed in 2 major ways. In the rational theoretical approach, items are based on the theorist's conception of personality trait to be measured. For example, to develop a measure of introversion and extroversion, we would ask ourselves what introverts and extroverts often say about themselves. And they would write items that captured those kinds of self-descriptions. For example, I'm the life of the party, or I think a lot before I speak or act. The NEO personality inventory is an example of this. A different approach to developing personality is the empirical approach. This is where items are chosen not because their content seems relevant to the trait on rational grounds, but because each item has been answered differently by groups of people. For example, introverts and extroverts, known to be different in the personality characteristic of interest. The MMPI and the more later version MMPI-2 is a widely used personality test developed according to the empirical approach. MMPI stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. In contrast to the NEO, which was about normal personality variables, the MMPI is a clinical personality test looking for mental health issues. It's probably the most extensively researched of all structured personality tests. In the original MMPI, developed by Hathaway and McKinley, they use the empirical method of test construction, in which they look at how questions differentiate people into one of 2 groups. As a result of using this empirical method, some items asked about things like your bowel movements and other things that you may not want to respond honestly about, if at all. Apart from not wanting to reply to a question like this, the MMPI items possess low face validity. And if you remember, face validity refers to the extent to which respondents can tell what items are measuring. The MMPI produces a profile of 10 clinical scales, and these scales were originally derived from the comparison to clinical groups. The norms originally based on all white people. Some items are dated and also quite offensive. That's why the MMPI-2 is a revised version of the original test. So it's based on a normative sample of 2,600 people covering a range of backgrounds. The MMPI-2 has a better wording and corrected grammatical errors in the original MMPI. The MMPI-2 consists of 567 items in which the participant is to respond either true or false. One of the good things with the MMPI-2 is that it does contain a lie scale, which consists of 15 lie items. So it can detect faked responses or responses that are slanted towards social desirability. Here are some sample items from the MMPI-2. Everything tastes the same, which you would respond as true or false. Or there's something wrong with my mind, which you would respond as true or false. Or whenever possible, I avoid being in a crowd. Or I've never indulged in unusual sexual practices, or someone has been trying to poison me, or I daydream often. As I mentioned, there are some lie items, and this is to test whether people are trying to appear more psychologically unwell than they actually are, or trying to appear more psychologically healthy than they are, for a range of different reasons. Here are some examples of lie items. I salivate at the sight of mittens. You would respond true or false. My eyes are always cold. You would respond true or false. Or frantic screams make me nervous. Or I use shoe polish to excess. Or the sight of blood no longer excites me. Or as an infant, I had very few hobbies. Or I like to put chameleons on tartan cloth. As you can see, these are fairly bizarre items, which even people who are quite psychologically ill rarely respond to positively. Anybody who responds positively to those items are likely to be faking their responses. Here are some of the clinical scales for the MMPI-2. The first scale is called hypochondriasis, and it measures health concerns. In particular, it measures whether people have a neurotic concern over bodily functioning. So we're not just talking about normal health concerns here, but rather over-focusing a neurotic concern on bodily functioning. The second scale is depression. This describes people who have poor morale, a lack of hope in the future, and a general dissatisfaction with one's own life situation. High scores are clinical depression, whilst lower scores are more general unhappiness with life. The third scale is hysteria. It describes hysterical reaction to stressful situations. Often people with hysteria have a normal facade and then go to pieces when faced with a trigger level of stress. People who tend to score higher include brighter, better educated, and people from higher social classes. Women score higher too. The fourth scale is psychopathic deviation. This looks at rebelliousness and social deviation. It looks at people who have a lack of acceptance of authority and are essentially amoral. Adolescents tend to score higher on this facet. The fifth scale is the masculinity-femininity scale. This scale tests for homosexual tendencies. Men tend to get higher scores. However, it's also related to intelligence, education, and socioeconomic status. The sixth scale is termed paranoia. It measures paranoid symptoms such as ideas of reference, feelings of persecution, grandiose self-concepts, suspiciousness, excessive sensitivity, and rigid opinions and attitudes. The seventh scale is termed psychasthenia. It was originally characterized by excessive doubts, compulsions, obsessions, and unreasonable fears. It now indicates conditions such as obsessive-compulsive disorder. It also shows abnormal fear, self-criticism, difficulties in concentration, and excessive guilt feelings. The eighth scale is termed schizophrenia. It assesses a wide variety of content areas, including bizarre thought processes and peculiar perceptions, social alienation, poor familial relationships, difficulties in concentration, and impulse control, lack of deep interest, disturbing questions of self-worth and self-identity, and sexual difficulties. The 9th scale is called hypomania. This tests for elevated mood, accelerated speech and motor activity, irritability, flight of ideas, and brief periods of depression. It tends to be elevated when people suffer from mania or bipolar disorder. The 10th scale is termed social introversion. This tests for a person's tendency to withdraw from social contacts and responsibilities. Now here are some profiles of particular cases. Scores of 50 on the MMPI-2 are average, and scores of 65 or above are abnormally high. A normal person may score very close to the average on everything that's the green line, whereas someone with depression, that's the blue line, or schizophrenia, the red line, will be well above the mean on various scales. As you can see, the depressed person scores more highly on the depression and hysteria scales, and the schizophrenic person scores more highly on the psychasthenia and schizophrenia scales, as one might expect. Many of the clinical scales are highly intercorrelated, which means that when scores on one scale go up, then scores on the other scale go up as well. But this is not necessarily a bad thing. For example, often depression and anxiety occur together. So you'd expect that a lot of the time, when someone scores high on one, they'd score high on the other as well. The MMPI is also valid for diagnosing a wide variety of clinical problems. For example, the MMPI-2 schizophrenia scale distinguishes patients with schizophrenia from patients with other severe psychological disorders like clinical depression. However, on the downside, it's a very time-consuming and expensive test when you think that there are over 500 items that need to be collected, but it's useful in clinical settings.